John Leszczyk has just been released from prison for the third time. Since childhood, he's been drawn to crime. 8 years ago, John was driving a van with a huge lottery check but never cashed it. The judge found him guilty, saying, "John got 7 years in a juvenile detention center." This harsh punishment turned him into a reckless criminal. At 18, he tried robbing mail carriers but emptied his gun while threatening them. He got 4 years. The judge even joked that if stupidity were a crime, John would have gotten life. 6 months after release, the same judge sent him back for car theft. After getting out, John wanted revenge on the judge, but the man had died 3 days earlier. Furious, John shot up a phone booth. At a bar, he saw an article about the judge's son, Nelson Biederman, opening a memorial. John saw his chance. While Nelson gave a speech, John broke into his car, stole loose change, emptied his inhaler, and spit in his coffee. Nelson, a spoiled rich kid, wasted money and yelled at his father's charity directors. John followed him. One day, Nelson, who has asthma, panicked when he found his inhaler empty. He rushed into a pharmacy, knocking shelves over. The owner shouted, "Thief!" while his wife muttered, "Another junkie." Nelson grabbed an inhaler, but the shopkeeper and wife thought he was robbing them. John made things worse by firing his gun. The shopkeeper's wife shot Nelson with a shotgun. The whole thing was caught on camera. Nelson's board of directors, tired of him, refused to help. His lawyer told him to plead guilty. In court, John watched as Nelson, relying on his father's reputation, tried to manipulate the judge. But the judge hated entitled people and insisted on following the law. Nelson's fate was left to a jury he called idiots, which they probably were. His lawyer, Dwayne, gave a ridiculous defense, referencing Jurassic Park. The jury found Nelson guilty of attempted robbery, sentencing him to 3 to 5 years at Rosemore Prison. John imagined Nelson suffering in prison but wanted to hurt him personally. When undercover cops tried to buy drugs from John, he played along to get arrested. Go to Rosemore to torment Nelson. He convinced the judge to send him there. On the prison bus, John befriended Nelson, suggesting they share a cell. Grateful for the kindness, Nelson agreed. The warden greeted new inmates, mocking anyone who claimed innocence by hitting them with a rifle. John bribed a guard to room with Nelson, who trembled as he entered the cell, surrounded by hostile prisoners. Sitting on the floor, he burst into tears. John warned Nelson to stop crying before others noticed, or he wouldn't last a week. He demanded Nelson show a ferocious snarl. But Nelson's attempt resembled a constipated grimace. Maintaining a prisoner costs $54 per day in the U.S., amounting to $28 billion annually. John joked it might be cheaper to let people steal car stereos. In the cafeteria, John pointed out prison dynamics, mentioning Leonard as the dominant figure. He warned Nelson to leave the table by 12:15, but Nelson got distracted reminiscing about his college days. At that moment, right in front of Nelson, Leonard stabbed another inmate. Guard Shanahan hit Leonard and asked who did it. Following John's suggestion, Nelson immediately pointed to Leonard. However, back in the cell, Leonard scolded him, saying, "In prison, you don't snitch." One of the more interesting places in prison is the shower. A burly inmate named Barry took a liking to the new guy, Nelson, and started flirting with him. But John claimed Nelson as his own, threatening another prisoner with a shiv and declaring. Nelson thanked John awkwardly, but was horrified by what prison life demanded, as Nelson processed the harsh realities. His lawyer explained that he had no access to the funds in his father's foundation, as he had been suspended as chairman while serving his sentence. John, meanwhile, bribed one inmate to constantly punch Nelson in the face, and another in the cafeteria to slip disgusting things into his food. In the showers, Barry continued to torment Nelson. The big guy was so enamored that he offered to buy Nelson at any price. Eventually, Barry set up a private encounter. Guard Shanahan called John out for trash duty and deliberately left Nelson's cell unlocked. Other inmates quickly grabbed Nelson, put a bag over his head, and dragged him to a room decorated with candles and garlands. Barry entered, offering Nelson some wine he had brewed in a toilet. However, things turned darker as Barry pressed a knife to Nelson's throat when he lied about Barry's weight. Barry, who despised dishonesty, declared that Nelson was now his property. He told Nelson he would have to please him but promised to take things slow. Barry even leaned in for a romantic nose rub, saying they'd start with a kiss. Later, as Nelson wrote to his pen pal, who turned out to be a young boy, an Aryan Brotherhood member urinated on him. This was a message from Leonard, who had just been released from solitary confinement. John informed Nelson that other inmates were placing bets on where Leonard would kill him. Naive as ever, Nelson approached Leonard to apologize, but Leonard immediately stabbed him in the leg with a fork. Leonard revealed that Nelson had offended him just as much as his own father had, and he had killed his father in the same way he intended to kill Nelson. Meanwhile, Barry continued to show his affections. John suggested Nelson hide from Leonard in solitary confinement. To get him there, John stood behind Nelson and punched a guard. The plan worked, and Nelson was sent to solitary. However, as time dragged on, Nelson began to suffer from hallucinations and isolation. After just 2 days, Nelson had enough and sought out the prison's chemist to buy something to end his life. The chemist sold him boat cleaner and a syringe. Nelson confided his plan to his pen pal, expressing his rage by saying he wanted to line up his tormentors and cut off their manhoods, unbeknownst to him. His young pen pal read the letter aloud to his entire class. Soon after, Leonard stormed into Nelson's cell, doused him with gasoline, and lamented that Nelson wasn't Jewish, as it would have made burning him alive more satisfying. Surprisingly, Nelson fought back, injuring Leonard. During the struggle, Leonard mistook the syringe of boat cleaner for drugs, injected himself, and immediately dropped dead. John was particularly stunned. This was not part of his plan. From that day forward, Nelson's life in prison took a sharp turn. The Aryan Brotherhood now backed him, and he rose to a position of power, able to order anyone around. However, unresolved romantic matters remained. Barry had fallen in love with Nelson over the months, and his feelings were hurt by Nelson's lack of reciprocation. In an emotional outburst, Barry nearly strangled Nelson in the bathroom. Nelson, feeling guilty for breaking Barry's heart, forgave him. When Aryan Brotherhood members burst into the bathroom to protect Nelson, he stopped them, asking them to leave Barry alone. John accidentally ended up in solitary confinement himself. Upon his release, he discovered that Nelson was now running the entire prison. Nelson had even organized a musical performed by the inmates. John grew increasingly frustrated as his revenge plan fell apart. Nelson, on the other hand, expressed gratitude, thanking John for helping him adjust to prison life. The next day was Nelson's parole hearing. To prepare, Nelson got help from his new friend, Barry. John entered their cell and handed Nelson a farewell gift, an already opened soda can, wishing him luck at the hearing. Suspicious, Nelson hesitated, but John pretended to be offended. To prove it was safe, John took a small sip. Nelson apologized and drank the rest, only to collapse moments later. John, gagging from the sip he'd taken, vomited in the toilet. With help from an accomplice, John carried Nelson's unconscious body away. The following day, at the parole hearing, Nelson appeared, unaware that "White Power" was written across his forehead. The committee immediately denied his release. Furious, Nelson attacked his cellmate during a fight. Under pressure, the cellmate admitted the hostility stemmed from Nelson's father, the judge. Guard Shanahan, annoyed the inmates fought without his permission, reminded everyone he controlled the fight schedule. He declared they'd settle their issues in a death match on Friday in the yard. The loser would die, and Shanahan vowed to kill the winner himself. A supervisor was assigned to oversee the fight. Other inmates eagerly placed bets on brutal outcomes like skull fractures or ears being bitten off. Nelson also received a visit from Barry, who had been deemed reformed by the parole board, thanks to Nelson. However, Barry confessed he couldn't be happy without Nelson, calling him his fish. Barry offered to help Nelson escape, but Nelson refused, saying, "I'll only leave this place in a body bag." Barry, in tears, suggested, "Then let's make a body bag for two." Nelson devised a plan. He contacted Dwayne, revealing that if he stayed in prison, he'd transfer control of his father's foundation to his adopted son, who would run it until Nelson's release. To execute this, Nelson adopted a fellow inmate. Meanwhile, the warden learned of the death match and bet $50 on Nelson, the newcomer. On Friday, the yard was packed as inmates cheered for the fight. The rules were simple. The first to die loses. Nelson armed himself with a screwdriver, while his opponent came more prepared. A shiv was thrown into the crowd, and another broke against Nelson's improvised body armor. Finally, both fighters resorted to their secret weapons, syringes filled with brightly colored chemicals. Nelson landed a fatal blow, but his opponent struck him in return. Shanahan declared it a tie and ordered the bodies removed before they started stinking. Nelson was buried, leaving his adopted son as the sole heir to an $8 million fortune. However, Barry refused to leave the cemetery. That evening, he dug up Nelson's grave with a shovel. Earlier, Nelson had obtained a special chemical from the prison chemist to put himself into a coma. Barry had bribed the coroner to ensure the plan worked. As Nelson prepared to leave, Barry reminded him of their agreement to rescue John, saying, "If it weren't for that jerk, we'd never have met." With that, they settled their differences. A year later, Barry and Nelson opened a winery called Duckling. However, their wine wasn't a hit. When a critic gave it a bad review, John and some former inmates, now working at the winery, intimidated him. The critic promised to give the wine a perfect score of 100, even though the bitter concoction with a hint of ammonia was disliked by everyone, including the winemakers themselves. That's all for today's video. Don't forget to show your support if you enjoyed it by hitting that like and subscribe button. See you in the comments and in the next one.